Well, good morning here from London and welcome to an FS Club webinar. Today I'm delighted to have with me Dan Johnson, who's the Vice President of Identity Products at Mastercard. And Dan is going to be talking about identity, a digital identity service, a digital identity service by Mastercard, your digital identity, your choice. Now, most of you will know me. I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien. And it really is my privilege and pleasure to be able to introduce and chair today's session. But I can only do so thanks to the generosity and tolerance of our sponsors who let us range widely and freely in the FS Club across all sorts of subjects to do with technology, economics, and finance. And today is definitely a subject dear to everybody's heart, a genuine confluence of technology, economics, and finance centered very much around identity. And Dan's going to be covering this in some depth. Just a reminder to all of you about the timings and the format. Basically, I will try and get out of your way as quickly as possible and let you hear from our expert. But just before I do so, a reminder that we've got at least 15 minutes for Q&A at the end discussion. I'll be feeding your questions into a discussion with Dan. But please do use the GoToWebinar question facility to send me those during Dan's presentation so that I can feed them in. I would point out to you that I'm here with you, so emails to me or texts or WhatsApp messages won't work. I'll only get them afterwards, so please do use the Q&A facility provided by the system. And very finally, to answer some obvious questions, the slides will be posted just after the session and are up there, and the recording will go up in approximately 2 days. So you'll be able to share this with friends, colleagues, family, what have you. But with no more ado, may I hand over to you, Dan? Here you go. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today about ID in general and also what Mastercard is doing in this space. We did want to keep this presentation relatively interactive, and so we have a couple of polls. And in fact, I think we're going to kick straight off with the first one. So we're quite interested in your view here on which biometric recognition technologies you use on your smartphone device, at least a couple of times a month. And so the options there are whether you use fingerprint, facial recognition, iris scan, voice recognition, or you don't use any at all. You've switched that off and gone for PIN.
Okay.
So if you'd like to.
Yep, I've just launched the poll, Dan. So people, you've got a few seconds there to come back. Oh, as ever, a very swift audience. Over 60% have voted in 12 seconds. So I'm just we're almost up to the 90% mark. I'm just gonna give it just a couple more seconds there before I close the poll. Great, I'm now showing the poll, and let me just share the results with you. So, and here are the results. So 39% for fingerprint, 31% for facial, 25% none, 2% iris scan, and 3% voice. So very much finger, facial, or not at all.
Excellent, yeah, and quite an even distribution really between those three. So I guess it's no surprise really that fingerprint tops the poll there, as it is quite convenient and also supported by a large number of devices, and also the facial recognition. So thanks to Apple and Google's drive really to introduce that as a convenience feature, does show that people are starting to feel a lot more comfortable really about biometric authentication when using devices. And perhaps we'll touch on that a little bit later. So I wanted to talk really about why digital identity is important. And so we're living in this world. We're all acutely aware of the world that we're living in right now, where we're having to interact online much more than we had ever really anticipated we would need to. And that is kind of bringing into stark realization how bad really our infrastructure is for recognizing that individuals are who they claim to be. So we still rely on introductions, face-to-face meetings, handshakes, looking people in the eye, and paper-based documents, which just don't translate into the digital world. I mean, you can't get your passport to somebody to prove that you are who you say you are, unless you post it, which is quite a scary prospect just generally. and then, scanning a copy of it or taking a photocopy. Not everybody has scanners. Not everybody has cameras on their smart devices. And so that's quite challenging. And then, by taking a copy of those documents, it's not always clear that that document is genuine. And then just accessing services is time consuming and frustrating. How many times have you gone to a website to buy that ideal product? And just when you click on the checkout button, you then get a page saying, well, before you continue, we just want your name and your address and your date of birth and your inside leg measurement and so on. And you're having to provide this information again and again and again. And it becomes irritating and frustrating and stands in the way of you actually getting access to the products and services that you want. And that in itself then lends itself to oversharing data. So now hundreds of organizations have our name and our address and our date of birth and other data. And we rely on those organizations to keep that data secure. And the reality is that those organizations aren't really keeping that data secure. I mean, they try their best. But, we're seeing data breaches almost every day. And some of them are quite horrifying in their scope and scale, which is then leading to identity theft, which we're seeing a considerable rise on, particularly as we're now moving more digital, and just fraud in general. So from a Mastercard perspective, when we started thinking about this, we thought, well, there's got to be a better way. How do you create a globally interoperable identity ecosystem, one that would enable individuals to be able to establish that they are who they say they are just once, and then use that everywhere, much in the same way as you apply for your credit card and you get your shiny new Mastercard in the post. Apparently there are some other payment network providers available, and that you can use that in 50 million stores online and around the world, wherever you go. So that reusability is really important and is something that is expected, but hasn't really transcended into the identity world. And this solution really needs to support both physical and digital interactions. So you need to be able to prove that you are who you say you are when you're meeting somebody in person, or when you're applying to open a bank account in a branch, if you can remember when we were able to do such things, as well as being able to interact digitally. The whole thing needs to be secure. So relying on static data just isn't going to cut it anymore. Anybody can steal my data. My data is available in the dark web, much as the same as yours is, and is available to purchase for criminals who want to access that data and commit crime. So using that static data just isn't going to work anymore. So what we need is dynamic data and biometric data. So using your fingerprint or your face or other data to help authenticate and prove that it's still you coming back again. But also using dynamic data. So, did I genuinely shop at this shop, and do I pay my electricity bills, and how do I do that, and so on. All of that dynamic data helping to prove that I am who I say I am, and I persist as being that persona. And that should all support a kind of privacy by design mantra, where your data is yours and protected, and that you're not oversharing that data. So the data needs to be under your control, and also really importantly, globally interoperable. So it's no good if you just have a national ID that's only available to be used in that one country. It would be a little bit like having a payment card that you can only use to shop nationally. That's not really going to work. You want to know that that identity could be used everywhere. So creating interoperable standards between national standards is going to be really important. And this is so important because of the rise of fraudsters really targeting online business, particularly as we're moving more and more online. So we're seeing an enormous increase in digitization and digital services. The data here is from the US, but that really applies pretty much across the board. So a doubling of access to digital services. But that is also then driving considerable fraud. So 52% of login attempts were considered high risk in 2019, and that number is continuing to increase. So as we're moving more and more online, fraudsters are getting smarter and starting to attack that particular vector. And new accounts are particularly hard hit. So a considerable number of accounts are proven to be fraudulent or fraudulent attempts to open those accounts. So we do need to be more vigilant, not just as organizations, but also as individuals, about how prevalent our data is and how easy that is to access, and ensure that data is protected. And we need better services to be able to do that. If you could go on to the next slide, please, Michael. And so what we really need is considerable services to kind of help support that and defeat those kind of fraud opportunities. We're really seeing that increase of services to help protect individuals is causing suboptimal user experiences, which in itself can then drive people away. So I mentioned before about the amount of data that you need to provide in order to prove that you are who you say you are to obtain a product and a service. The more data that organizations need to collect and the more checks that they do against your identity, so verifying passports and driver's licenses and utility bills and so on, that's really standing in the way of consumers getting the products and services that they want, which relates transcribes into a suboptimal user experience. And this is really big business. That suboptimal user experience is costing organizations an awful lot of money in lost business, but also the amount of fraud that's being conducted is also costing organizations a considerable amount. So nearly $3.5 billion just in the US in 2018 through the new account opening processes. So that's an enormous figure, and that's just one market. And you apply that around the world, and this really is quite disturbing, actually, the amount of money that is being lost as a result of fraud and suboptimal user experiences. If you could move on to the next slide. So we started by looking at a set of principles against which we could build a identity ecosystem. And I'm not going to go through them all and explain, but we identified these 10 principles, and you can read more about our approach and these principles on our portal idservice.com, and I'll provide a link a little bit later on. The principles here really are that anybody should be able to obtain a digital identity. This is not something where we end up creating a two-tier or multi-tier system where some individuals are able to prove that they are who they say they are, and others can't. I mean, there are over 1 billion people in the world today that don't have any recognized form of identity, and they are then excluded not just financially, but from education and healthcare and other services, which are real human rights that we should all have access to. People should be able to control the use of their data and not have large organizations controlling that data. Now, that might sound a little bit rich coming from Mastercard, which is a massive global organization. We don't think that we should hold your data or store it or monetize it or use it in any way. What we do think is that you should be empowered to hold that data yourself and control who has access to it and revoke the access. So very much the principles of the General Data Protection Regulation. We also think that the solution should be simple. So this concept of reusable identity, where you go through the effort of establishing that you are who you say you are digitally, and then can reuse that identity multiple times rather than re-establishing that identity each time. So think about periodic review from a financial services perspective, where you have to fill in a form to say that you are who you say you are, and then provide copies of documentary evidence and so on. Imagine if instead you can just take a live selfie, prove that you are the same person that opened the account in the first place, and that then satisfies your periodic review contribution. That would be a much simpler, better, and more delightful experience than the kind of paper-based and rather intrusive processes that exist today. And again, the other principles, which are equally important, are available to read about in more detail on our portal idservice.com. The model that we created to to establish an identity ecosystem is actually quite simple, and it started really with allowing users to interact with relying parties. So the reality here is that normal people, so if we take my wife, for example, is a normal person, she's just really interested in accessing products and services, not really interested in the intricacies of data flows, data security, and identity principles. So she just wants to get stuff done. And so creating that relationship between the user and the relying party is really where we started. The problem with that is that relying parties can't necessarily trust that the user is who they claim to be. So we then created identity verification providers. So these are organizations that an individual would naturally trust to have data about them to verify a claim. So for example, if I wanted to prove that I do actually hold a BSc honors in computer science, then I could go to my university and they would be able to verify that, yes, there was a Dan Johnson that did study at that time and did in fact get a degree. And it makes sense for that organization to prove that data. Equally, it makes sense for the passport office to be able to prove that I did apply for a passport and I am eligible to travel internationally. And it makes sense for the driver's license authority to be able to prove that I am eligible to drive a motor vehicle in the United Kingdom, and so on. So all of these organizations can help to prove or add weight to a claim that I make. And the more that those claims are made, the more that the relying party can believe and trust that that information is true and accurate and belongs to me and not anybody else. The fourth partner in our model is trust providers. And that's mostly because Mastercard is really a B2B organization and not direct to consumer. And so what we wanted to do was provide the tools for an individual to manage their identity and then share that data with relying parties using apps and services that they were already familiar with. So banks, mobile network operators, organizations that already have lots of consumers and considerable trust in the market to be able to host that capability and then provide that directly to the consumer. And Mastercard really sits in the middle. So again, we don't hold any data. What we do is facilitate those data flows in a secure and safe and transparent manner, and provide a set of rules so that relying parties, trust providers, identity verification providers, and users all understand what's happening with the data and how much they can rely on it, and also to provide some form of recourse in case things go wrong. If you could go on to the next slide. And so what does this look like? So it's a mobile-based solution, which really encompasses liveness detection and document scanning to help to establish an identity, and then linking into identity verification providers to bring all of that data together in a way that can then be shared digitally and also physically with organizations that are interested in that. That reduces friction considerably, creates considerable amounts of trust, so users are comfortable being able to share data in this way, and organizations can then rely on that information and create much more delightful user experiences and concentrate on selling the products and services that they are there for, as opposed to concerning themselves overly with onboarding and verification processes. And all of that can then create new business opportunities for organizations in verifying data, and also considerably reduce costs in the market when it comes to onboarding, all of which gives more control to the user in understanding where those relationships are, what data has been shared, and how that data is going to be used. On the next slide. And so the benefits then really to each of the partners. So from a user perspective, this is really easy to use, really simple, and can be trusted. Your identity just gets reused wherever you need to, and you're only sharing the core information that you need. So for example, if I want to buy my bottle of wine from a self-service checkout, and many of my use cases are wine related, and you can draw whatever conclusion you like from that. So if I scan my bottle of wine, the light goes red. I have to wait for a teenager to come out and tell me that I look old, which is not really a great user experience, I find. So it would be nicer if I could just prove that I am actually over the age of 18, youthful looking as I am. And so I could either, get out my driver's license, which contains my name, my address, my driving entitlement, my photograph, and my full date of birth, which is really oversharing considerably. Or I could just send a flag that says I am over the age of 18, and that can be verified through a number of sources. So I could start to restrict the amount of information that organizations hold for me. My supermarket doesn't need to know my date of birth. They just need to know that I am over the age of 18 in order to complete that transaction. So I can reduce that data, which means that if the supermarket data sources get compromised in any way, my date of birth won't be one of those data attributes that's in that data that's stolen. For relying parties, this is a much more efficient way of verifying and acquiring new customers, which creates a much more delightful and simpler user experience. It reduces manual interactions and paper-based processes and additional verification steps, reduces fraud considerably and reduces the associated losses with those, and reduces the amount of data that needs to be held on file, so making compliance with the General Data Protection Regulation and other associated regulations considerably easier. For identity verification providers, here's an opportunity to generate revenue. So there is effort involved in verifying identity data, and relying parties will pay to acquire that trusted data. And so identity verification providers who can demonstrate that an individual has a qualification or pays an electricity bill or is entitled to drive a motor vehicle, all of those verifications can be monetized, again with the consent of the individual, and so that creates a brand new revenue stream for data providers who want to provide this data through a trusted network. And then for trust providers, this provides a mechanism for considerably improving the interactions that they have with individuals. So rather than a bank simply providing financial services, can also provide identity services. So the bank then becomes top of mind whenever that individual is interacting with relying parties and sharing their identity data, which then provides opportunities to extend into further markets and further opportunities. So again, an additional revenue stream for trust providers. And this is not just something to open a bank account or to prove that you are over the age of 18 so that you can buy your weekend wine. This really is able to prove that you are who you say you are and share data with a number of organizations across many sectors. So being able to access employment services, prove that you are who you say you are, that you have the qualification that you did, which will then considerably improve background checks so that organizations can get the right people in the door in a timely manner. Then also filing your taxes. It's a very exciting part of my life every year. And applying for benefits and also demonstrating your entitlement, but then also accessing education and healthcare, and proving that you have insurance, and so on, opening bank accounts, applying for credit and loans, verifying your income, just really authenticating and proving that it's the same person coming back in again. Shopping online, gaming online, as particularly where there are age restrictions, and making sure that our children are kept safe and away from content that they shouldn't really be seeing, and making digital payments. And then also, really excitingly, being able to travel. So imagine a world where you could travel just using your face, so without having to carry multiple documents, so visas and passports and tickets and boarding cards and so on. Imagine if you could just travel seamlessly, just using your face, and not just travel on an aircraft, but also then check into your hotel, pick up the keys to your hire car without having to queue, and without having to rummage through to find various bits of paper to prove your entitlement or booking. So ID enables you to access a number of services across a number of sectors in a very similar and convenient and well understood way. So to kind of summarize the kind of core benefits, really. So from a government perspective, they can really play two roles within such an ecosystem. So firstly, as an identity verification provider, proving the sign of life of an individual, which is quite helpful, particularly when it comes to things like pension disbursements. So proving that the person is still alive and entitled to receive that payment, and really providing secure and simple access to a number of services, such as e-government services, but then also as a relying party. So providing that trusted mechanism for providing that interaction between the individual and the relying party. So using a national ID service, for example, which is something that many of our European countries already do. On the next slide, the advantages really for financial institutions can really play three roles. So as a trust provider, so providing that kind of capability of providing services directly to the user and increasing that customer engagement and stickiness. Also as identity verification providers, providing that sign of life, so by analyzing transactions and providing a sense of whether the person is still continuing to behave in a normal pattern, and then also as a relying party for onboarding. And then on the next slide, for relying parties, just consuming identity data and being able to considerably improve the user experience while also reducing fraud. So no more this kind of trade-off between security and convenience, actually having a convenient, delightful experience that is also highly secure and compliant with KYC regulations, allowing individuals to be able to be onboarded regardless of whether they hold a national identity. So being able to onboard consumers from other markets as well. On to the next slide, please. So I wanted to just very briefly talk about a couple of case studies. So starting in Australia, so we've signed a deal with Optus to work with them directly on their onboarding and checkout experiences by integrating our identity solution into that journey, and that's something that we'll be talking a lot more about in the coming months as we continue our partnership with Optus. Back in on the next slide, please. Back in August this year, we started working with Australia Post and Deakin University, recognizing that the identity and verification processes are really quite challenging and require a considerable amount of data to be provided. So we wanted to demonstrate how our solution could considerably reduce the number of data items that are collected and provide that much more convenient service. This example with Deakin University and using Australia Post really takes an existing identity. So this was not an identity created by Mastercard. So this is an identity created by Australia Post Digital ID service, and allows that to be used through our ID network to access an online exam. So the student can sign in and prove that they are genuinely who they claim to be, that they are also part of the student record, and then can go ahead and sit the digital exam. So quite a simple use case, and this one demonstrates how multiple different kinds of ID, in this case a national ID, can be used and consumed within the network to provide identity assurance. On the next slide. Just recently, we announced that we completed a pilot in the UK to explore how test credentials, so COVID-related test credentials, could be provided as part of a digital ID to an airline within an airport environment to prove that a person was eligible to travel and then also eligible to be accepted at their country of destination. So this was really just a pilot use case and demonstrating how it is important that you can demonstrate your additional attributes of your identity to access particular products and services. And I can happily talk about that more a little bit later. in terms of why us and why is this important to Mastercard? So we're connected to 23,000 banks. If you can go on to the next slide, please, Michael. We're connected to 23,000 banks and 50 million merchants. We operate in 210 markets. We understand what trust frameworks look like. You know that you can use your Mastercard, and again, apparently there are some other payment network providers available. You can tap your Mastercard on a Ingenico or Gemalto machine at any merchant anywhere in the world, wherever you see the concentric circles of Mastercard, and you know that payment will go through. That you don't have to worry about currency translation. You don't have to worry about who the merchant is or what they might do with your data. And if something goes wrong, you know that there is some recourse. So we know how to build highly scalable and highly available networks. We know how to build trust. We operate with a considerable number of organizations. And so we feel that we're, if not uniquely placed, and certainly well placed in the market to help to bring together all of the collaborations that are required in order to establish a successful, globally interoperable identity ecosystem. So I wanted to leave you with one more poll, which is on the next slide. Thank you. I've talked a little bit about trust providers and who those organizations should be. So I'm quite interested in your view of who do you trust to help you manage your identity data? So should that be your bank or your government, a mobile network operator, one of the big tech players like Apple, Google, and Facebook, and so on, or a payment network provider like Mastercard?
Well, as you can see, Dan, I've launched the poll. It is interesting. We have Jane Wormleighton here saying how well explained it is. But I mentioned to a friend I was attending this webinar. Her response was that she wouldn't trust Mastercard or any other major financial house with digital ID under any circumstances. So very, very interesting, these sorts of points. I also might point out Alan Peake is curious as to what do you do without a mobile phone. He's got a 20-year-old Nokia. Just thought I'd get those comments in. Anyway, the audience is pretty much voted. I'll just leave it open another second or two. And I'm now about to close the poll. Great. And I'll share the results. Obviously, there's multiple choice, as you say here. And you can see here more trusting of the bank than the government, and about as trusting of Mastercard and other payment network providers that are apparently out there as the government as well. So interesting results there.
So it's quite consistent, actually, with a kind of UK-centric view that banks kind of come out top, and that's really consistent with a lot of the user analysis that we've done so far. Governments in the UK tend to score quite low, whereas in Europe the government actually scores higher than banks generally, it's quite pleasing actually to see Mastercard quite high there. So we don't especially want to directly help you manage your identity data. What we want to do is to provide that trust framework, and then allow organizations like banks and governments and mobile network operators to provide them with the tools to help you manage your data. So as I mentioned earlier in the in this session, if you want to find out more about what Mastercard are doing, we've published quite a lot of information. So not just our press releases, but also some white papers on what we think about identity, and those you can access through our portal idservice.com, and the link is displayed.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dan, for that. And folks, the link there, I myself have read many of those documents, and it's a fairly open platform with a lot of good publications, well worth covering. We've got a large audience today, Dan, and a lot of questions. So I'm going to kind of kick in. Lou Zarowski is curious about what standards is Mastercard aligning with for permissioned or limited data exchange? Is there such a thing yet, say, in the ISO world? Or is Mastercard effectively going forward and creating a new one, or no standard at all?
So there are lots of standards, is the truth of the situation currently. So we contributed into the Australian standard TDIF to obviously to ensure that we're compliant, but then also to help kind of establish those standards. We are part of the consultation process that's ongoing in the UK government. With the trust framework that's being designed there, which will extend GPG 44 and 45. we contribute to the NIST standards as well. There aren't really any global standards that are emerging at the moment. The closest is the EIDAS regulation, and also we're contributing into the consultation process to extend the EIDAS into the private sector. So the reality at the moment is it's quite a dynamic environment as far as standards are concerned. We are contributing into those processes, as a number of organizations are, and will continue to do so. The key thing, I think, really is going to be interoperability of those standards, as opposed to necessarily creating one single universal standard that everybody will follow. And that's really a kind of sign, really, of the way that different governments and different cultures approach identity. So if you look at India, for example, massively successful scheme of registering 1.2 billion people, but doing that in capturing that data and holding it centrally, which is something that in the UK is abhorrent. But it doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It works for that nation and for that culture. It just doesn't work in all. So the answer is more likely to be creating interoperability between national and regional standards, as opposed to necessarily creating a single standard.
I'm just sort of curious, Dan, in the warm up here, we built an identity, we ZN built an identity system 5 years ago for an Australian insurer. Your two case studies that were real as opposed to a pilot were both in Australia. Is there any national propensity there or standards that are driving that?
It's an interesting market.
Why Oz for you?
It's a really interesting market. I mean, it's quite a small market, so 25 million people. It's also quite dispersed, and also quite diverse. There is also quite a considerable amount of support from organizations for collaboration, which is really important in identity. So, if you were to look at the way that Australian banks behave versus the way that UK banks behave, there's much more collaboration, natural collaboration between the Australian banks versus the UK banks, for example, which are just naturally more competitive. And so there are a number of kind of factors really that have just helped move identity and the identity conversation further in Australia, which is one of the reasons why it's become a key market for us.
Well, let's moving back to the UK. Nicholas Hill is curious about what evidence do we have to suggest that UK consumers wish to use this, and surely the open banking-based proposition where consumers use their bank-validated credentials to him appears simpler and easier. We had a couple of questions as well about other countries. John Falk, for example, is curious in countries that have national digital ID cards, Belgium, Estonia. Is the issue that you put forward, particularly with your U.S. numbers, quite as big as you indicated there? So those are sort of two areas about more international comparisons. Then I'd like to move quickly onto some data issues.
So the approach really for the European market is going to be very much consuming identities that are already created under the national ID schemes, rather than creating brand new identities. So working very much within those schemes and rules, and then increasing the acceptance of those services. A lot of the time, the identity usage is quite limited in markets, and so the job really is to just make identity much more mainstream and allow individuals to be able to use their identity for all sorts of services, not just kind of a bank ID. But being able to, prove your age and access a wide range of services, but also be able to provide identity for people who don't have bank accounts, and maybe either don't want them or want to get into banking, but don't have a bank ID already to be able to do so.
Okay. There are quite a few comments really about data quality. I'll just read a few out. So, for example, John Falk says, as a general rule, I never give the correct date of birth to any non-governmental or financial sites if I can avoid it. Bob McDowell's curious about data debris, toxic and otherwise, proliferates, and who's going to clean this up. And we've got a question here from, sorry, I'm just trying to find it. Yes, from Edwina Morton. Isn't this the blockchain equivalent of ID, and that the introduction of fraudulent identities, though possibly not easy, will undermine the whole system? The fraudsters are getting clever all of the time. So I'll just leave those with you. But how do going to keep this data clean?
So if the user is in more control of their data, then the user's interactions then help to keep that data up to date. And also by minimizing the amount of data that organizations need and collect means that the effort to update that data and the data debris is then considerably minimized. So I don't have to share my date of birth with anybody anymore in this kind of future view. All I need to do is to share the fact that I'm over the age of 18 if I want to access age-restricted products and services, or that could be over 21 or whatever the age of consent is for whatever product or service that I'm getting. So I agree. I don't want to share my date of birth either. I don't think that anybody has a particular right to access that data. I'd rather just show that I'm eligible to access that service. I'd rather not prove or share my address, because then it becomes just an aggravation to keep that address up to date. I don't get paper-based bank statements. I don't really get many letters anymore. If anybody wants to write to me, I'm very welcome to do so. I get lonely. There's no need to have my address. I just need to prove that I'm resident, for example. So that means that the data doesn't have to be updated quite so much. And then when I'm interacting digitally with services, then my data can be refreshed and updated with my consent. So, if my data has changed for any reason, as I'm interacting with an organization, again, that maybe I haven't interacted with in the last year, it can say, oh, well, my address is updated, or I'm now over the age of 18, so I can now access more services. And so that data update can be done much more naturally, in a much more delightful user experience, rather than having to fill in forms and physically go and update data in multiple data sources.
Timothy Coleman is just curious. This is kind of a yes/no question, really, but you mentioned the use case of a supermarket needing to be able to identify and verify your age without knowing your date of birth. Are you using zero knowledge proofs for that?
Yes, we are. The trust framework really helps to demonstrate that capability. So the fact that there is evidence that proves that I'm over the age of 18, and that if required, that evidence could be provided. But in reality, that evidence doesn't actually need to be provided at the point of that transaction, because the trust framework guarantees that the data is true and accurate and belongs to the person interacting.
Okay. Ashley Winton says, I notice you're not a member of TISA, which is due to get certification by the DCMS. Which industry, SSI, identity bodies do you support?
We talk to a lot of organizations. We are a member, and in some instances, silent members of many organizations that are all working towards standards. So we do actively contribute to a number of bodies and organizations. We are a particularly active and founding member of Trust Over IP, which is looking particularly at self-sovereign identity and how that could help to bring together a number of frameworks in such a way to create an identity ecosystem.
Richard Parler is curious, where's the data being stored? Is it being stored on the phone, Fraudster's Delight, or how are you doing this?
So a mix, really. So where possible, the data is stored at source. So my qualification data will remain in a data store at the university. My passport data will remain within the protection of the passport office. Where data does need to be stored, it will be stored and securely encrypted on my device, and won't be stored on centralized servers. We don't store the data in blockchain. For a number of reasons, that's not a great idea. So particularly for actually quite a number of edge cases that make immutable data storage quite challenging. So the kind of simple answer is where necessary, the data is stored and encrypted on the user's mobile device, and our preference really is that we don't move that data around, so that data remains with the identity verification providers in their secure data stores.
Yael Ben Cohen is curious, is the service only open to individuals with a Mastercard? What's the commercial model for using the service?
No, it's open to people who also don't have a Mastercard. Which is one of the reasons why we created the ID Service brand, which does share some colors with the Mastercard logo, but otherwise is quite different, to create that differentiation between Mastercard as a payments business and our ID service business. So no, the answer is it is open to everybody.
Well, you pointed out there's a lot of interest about sort of the non-financial data. You pointed out that your university might be able to say that you had studied and had a degree. Mine might say I had a degree. I'm not sure they can vouch that I studied. I'll leave that alone. But Ailva & Cohen is curious about employment and education data being added to that. I've also got a couple of comments here about, liability when things go awry is relatively straightforward for financial transactions. This is from Andrew Churchill. But how does Mastercard manage an erroneous claim for degree certifications from myriad universities around the world? So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So and hey, Andrew, the job really is to minimize the opportunities for liability, which we can do through trust frameworks and through technology. So if we can prove that the person asking about Dan Johnson's qualification is actually Dan Johnson, and to create that binding between those two data sources. So the university have a data store which has my name, my address, and my date of birth. And I can prove that if I can prove that I am that Dan Johnson, then we can create a binding between that data, my qualification, and me, and then share that result with others. So it might not be that I have to actually share the name of my university or the year that I studied there, which could then help to identify more information or unlock more data about me. It could just be that I have a qualification, for example. So yeah.
We've got a lot of questions here, and we're coming close to the end, and I'm going to have to bundle them up. But folks, all of your questions with your emails we'll get to Dan, and he'll be able to answer them directly if he's got the time to do it. But I'd like to just pick up a couple quick ones if we can. Bob McDowell again. What powers do the executors and other personal representatives of the deceased have over the data or the destruction of the data?
So it's a really interesting question, and one that we are working to solve for. So that kind of delegated authority. So not just a power of attorney, but then also managing identity data on behalf of children. So particularly when it comes to travel, for example. So we do see that it is an important requirement to be able to manage identity on behalf of both living and deceased individuals, and so proving that relationship between those individuals and consenting where appropriate to for an individual to manage the data on behalf of somebody else. So it's a capability that we are working on.
Does ID have facilities to help make my personal data be tradable as a tradable asset by myself?
That's a really interesting question. I'm going to think about that a bit more.
Okay. And then just a final question, and not a bad question to close on, from Peter Bunker. Dan, how are Mastercard staff dealing with this? What's the take up in your own staff?
So it's something that we are working on. So we're kind of instigating this principle of eating our own dog food, and starting to explore how our onboarding processes, so employment onboarding processes, and then also physical building accesses could be improved with an identity service. So we're still in the process of launching our service, and we are actively exploring how that could benefit our own employees, really to kind of test and learn as we develop our products and service.
Well, that's all we've got time for. In fact, more time than we had. I'd just like to say thanks in 3 rounds, if I may. But what I would like to close on is an interesting comment from Trevor Hilder, who points out, I don't expect to be delighted by any of this. I want it to be so boring I don't notice it, which I think is a really important point that we often forget as technology people, as finance people, and even in the economic sphere. If we can reduce the snags and basically the transaction friction, one should be seeing that universe expand. And I can see that as a nice selfish goal for Mastercard, but one that we'd all appreciate. So I think this is really super. Thank you for your time. But just before I close, firstly to our sponsors, I think many of you are already aware of ID, but I hope that Dan's giving you a bit of the background, frankly, a bit of the personality to it. I'm expecting, given that we've been running sessions on identity for some time and building systems, this approach by Mastercard is well worth watching, and we wish you every success in that regard. For the audience, may I also say thank you. A reminder that everything's up on the web, and in fact tomorrow, Dan mentioned GDPR. We'll be having an interesting session with Alvarez and Marshall and also Freshfields on addressing data privacy, managing the risk of future liability. So the topic runs in many forms, and I think you'll find tomorrow equally interesting. But Dan, you've been superb. Thanks so much for the preparation and time. Unfortunately, in these days of webinars and lockdowns and COVID, I am unable to open the floodgates of audience applause. So I have brought forward a very sophisticated medieval Korean karmic clapper, and I will therefore use it on behalf of the audience to give you applause. We'd like to thank you very much. We're going to watch this with great interest, and it'd be really good to get an update on this at some time that you felt was appropriate. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.